Thanks a lot to the Minister for his presentation. I want to focus mostly on the question of the TTIP, which again, like SCA, I mean, it's a bit difficult for us to have a full discussion here whenever the mandate that you've been discussing and has been agreed, we have to rely on leaked versions of it, which may or may not be the final version. So there is like a preliminary question there about how, I mean, the Parliament in its resolution from a couple of months ago called to be involved in the process all the way through for full transparency, etc. How is that to be achieved if the full Parliament can't have access to the documents? Going from what we have seen in the leaked mandates, which I presume are quite accurate, the indications is that it's a very broad mandate that's been given to the Commission, which for me contains the danger of agreeing something that will represent a race to the bottom in terms of social, labour, environmental standards on both sides of the Atlantic, where you have regulatory convergence downwards as opposed to upwards. And in particular, I would raise the question about the investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, which features strongly in the draft mandate, despite the points that Bert made that I would agree with about the well-developed nature of the legal systems in both the EU and the US, considering that the majority of cases taken in investor-state dispute settlement mechanisms so far by corporations come from corporations based in the EU or the US. This clearly has the potential to be a major new development in terms of world trade. And would the Minister not share any concerns being expressed by many NGOs that this may be used by major corporations to challenge public health, environmental, labour, social standards implemented by governments? For example, the case is ongoing at the moment by Philip Morris against Australia and against Uruguay for introducing restrictions on cigarette packaging, very similar to what the Irish government is currently considering. The case is brought by Lone Pine versus Canada for restrictions introduced against fracking in Quebec, again something that many European countries are discussing, and there's a debate and a keen interest of many people. But is there not a danger here that if an investor-state dispute settlement mechanism is created between the EU and the US, you're creating a corporate bill of rights giving privileged interests and access to justice to corporations as opposed to citizens? And what's wrong with the ordinary justice system that the rest of us, the citizens, have to use? Why isn't that good enough for the corporations? Secondly, and again I think it's a question that's followed by a lot of people on TTIP, is the question of access to GMOs, but also hormones in cattle, ractopamine in beef and pork, where if you read the statements of the political representatives of the establishment parties in America, but also the industry, it's clear that this is a major offensive interest. That's not in dispute. But in the mandate, in the draft mandate that I have seen anyway, there is the words precautionary principle, which are a principle established and agreed in the EU, don't appear in at least the leaked mandate that I saw. And is that something that you feel can be, is there a danger that these are principles that will be negotiated away in the course of discussions, particularly in order to get access to public procurement? In general, do we not have a problem in negotiating openly and honestly with the US when it just becomes clear that actually you have a massive invasion of privacy, a breach of European regulations on data protection, largely facilitated by corporations, US corporations based in Ireland, Google, Facebook, etc. With the PRISM programme, it seems like a mass gathering of data on European citizens and others based in Europe. How really can we have a discussion and a negotiation about intellectual property and all of these things whenever this is happening at the other side? Just the final point I'd make on a separate issue is I think it's hard to describe the market access regulation as a success. I mean, there was an ACP meeting over the weekend, and on Saturday a number of countries expressed their opposition to how this happened, how they feel that the partnership model is finished, how they feel threatened and bullied by this process, by this regulation, in order to sign up to economic partnership agreements. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Paul. I don't share Paul's concern that, you know, by entering into bilateral trade negotiations with the US, you know, that this creates a race to the bottom or risks a race to the bottom. I think, as I said, you know, Europe goes with a very clear set of public policies that it seeks to protect, but in many ways it shares common values with the US that I think will make it easier to negotiate with the US. There's a lot of common approaches that make it easier, and indeed, you know, I think you have yourself recognised that in the investment area, you know, there is a very strong established legal tradition that supports you know, doing a deal with the US. Again, you raise the issue of GMOs and hormones. Of course, there will continue, and that has been recognised indeed by the President of the Commission, President Barroso, that there are different approaches, and there will remain different approaches at the end of this agreement. There will be different public policies in different areas. And of course, you might recognise that US would like to see, you know, Europe change certain regulations in order to make it easier for people to trade from the US. But, you know, Europe will cling to very, you know, solidly defend public policy interests that are important to its citizens. And I think that will continue to be the driving force. But I think you still enter into negotiations because you open up opportunities for trade that don't confound the public policy objectives that you have. And I think that's the balance. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to comment on issues around privacy, which, you know, they don't fall directly into my area, and the issue of data protection is in a different area. The market access mandate, I'm surprised that you would present it as people being threatened and bullied. You know, I think this has been long an ambition, both of the Parliament and of the Commission. Okay, there may have been a difference about the speed with which you got there, but, you know, it was an issue not of principle, it was of giving countries time, but at the same time having a deadline that would be reasonable and would, you know, promote reforms in those countries that I think, you know, are balanced and desirable reforms. On the investor protection, there are different approaches, and there is some member states have bilateral. Oh yes, some member states already have bilateral investment agreements with the US, and this was taken into account. So it was an issue in the development of the mandate. I know that member states had differences, and given the well-developed system in both sides, it's unlikely that this will prove problematic for the EU. So I think the concerns that you flagged were very amply raised by a number of member states, and the Commission in negotiating will be very conscious of those concerns. But I think it wouldn't be seen that an investment protection agreement that could be negotiated would in any way facilitate the undermining of public policy. That certainly is not what would be envisaged. So, Chairman, I think